Have you ever felt that like incredible sense of oneness, that feeling of being totally connected with nature, with other people, with like, the entire universe? Well, that's what we're diving into today. The science behind this, like really common but kind of mysterious experience. What's going on in our brains and bodies when we feel that sense of unity?
Yeah, it's a super fascinating question, and a one that, researchers are finally starting to kind of shed some light on. You'd think, right, that feeling at one with everything means we have this like totally unified sense of self. But what cognitive science is showing us is that's not exactly how it works.
Okay, so that sounds kind of like a paradox. I mean, how can we feel so connected if our brains are actually like fragmented?
Yeah.
We've got two really awesome books to help us kind of unpack this whole thing. Altered Traits by Daniel Goleman, which goes super deep into meditation research, and The Embodied Mind by Varela, Thompson, and Roche, which explores how our minds are like completely intertwined with our bodies and, the world around us.
Yeah, the embodied mind really challenges that, like traditional view of the self. There's this concept they talk about called enactivism, which basically says our minds aren't just passively taking in information, like we're actively creating our realities through our interactions with the environment.
So it's not just our brains influencing our bodies, but our bodies and experiences are actually shaping our brains too.
Exactly. It's like this constant feedback loop, this intricate dance between like mind, body, and the environment. And, that interconnectedness, that could be a key part of this whole oneness puzzle.
That makes me think about how we often feel that sense of oneness when we're, really immersed in nature. Like the boundaries between ourselves and the natural world just kind of start to blur.
Yeah, that's a perfect example of how our environment can really like influence our sense of self. And it actually reminds me of something the embodied mind talks about, how our perception of something as basic as color can teach us about how this idea of oneness is constructed.
Okay, color perception. How does that tie into this feeling of like being at one with everything?
Well, think about it. Color isn't some inherent property of objects, right? It's an experience our brains create based on like the interplay of light, our eyes, and our neural wiring. And what's even more fascinating is that research has shown that different cultures actually categorize colors differently.
So what one culture might call blue, another might see as green. That's wild.
It is. And what it highlights is that our experience of reality, even something as seemingly objective as color, is actually shaped by, our cultural context, our individual perception. And this leads us to think maybe oneness, just like color, isn't some like fixed objective reality out there, but rather an experience that's constructed by our individual brains, our bodies, and, our experiences.
That's a really interesting way to think about it. So it's not about achieving some like permanent state of oneness, but about understanding how that feeling like arises in the first place, right?
Right. Exactly. And that's where all this research on meditation comes in. Altered Traits is full of these fascinating case studies. Like they talk about this Tibetan monk, Mingyur Rinpoche, who can seemingly enter these incredibly deep meditative states, like almost instantaneously.
Oh yeah, I remember reading about him. Scientists were like totally blown away by his brain activity. Did they find like super high levels of gamma waves and they were like synchronized across his whole brain?
Yes. And these same patterns have been observed in other experienced meditators, too. So think about the kind of awareness these folks describe. Expansive, interconnected, unified. It's like really tempting to connect those neural patterns to that feeling of oneness.
So maybe, just maybe, specific brain states could be linked to that feeling.
It's a compelling possibility. But before we like get too carried away, Altered Traits also emphasizes that these brain states aren't just magically appearing, right? They're cultivated through, years of dedicated practice.
So it's not just about sitting on a cushion and hoping for the best. It takes like real effort, real commitment to train the mind.
Absolutely. And one of the key skills these meditators develop is something called effortless concentration. It's not about forcing your mind to focus, but rather cultivating this state of relaxed, open awareness.
Yeah, I can see how that could be like really challenging. Our minds are usually so busy, jumping from one thought to the next.
Exactly. And when researchers looked at the brain activity of these experienced meditators during this state of effortless concentration, they found something really interesting. A decrease in activity in a specific area of the brain called the posterior cingulate cortex, or PCC.
The CC dot now. Remind me again, what does that do?
Well, you can think of the PCC as the part of your brain that generates that constant inner monologue, that voice that's always, chattering away, creating that sense of a separate me versus the world.
So when the PCC chills out, our inner critic takes a break.
Yeah.
And maybe that opens up space for this sense of oneness to, like, emerge.
That's one way to interpret it. And it makes sense when you consider that, seasoned meditators, when they experience this quieting of the PCC, often describe feeling a sense of undistracted awareness and effortless doing. It's like they're merging with their experience rather than observing it from a distance. Like the boundaries between the doer and the doing just kind of dissolve, which is, super relevant to this whole feeling of oneness.
So you're saying this feeling of being, like, one with the experience, it's not just some, mystical woo-woo concept. It's something that can actually be observed in the brain.
Exactly. And what's even more exciting is the sense of oneness. It isn't limited to like seasoned meditators. You might be surprised to learn that similar brain states have been observed during something called flow states.
Oh, flow states. Like
Oh,
when you're totally absorbed in something.
yeah.
Whether it's painting, playing music, or even, like, playing a video game.
Precisely. And just like in meditation, flow states, they involve this like intense focus, this merging of action and awareness, and that sense of self-consciousness, it kind of fades away.
And if I'm remembering correctly, Flow by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, that book explores those activities that can induce flow states. Didn't he find that, like, regardless of the activity, flow states share certain um, characteristics?
That's right. And some researchers actually believe that these flow states might trigger similar neural activity as meditation, including those high levels of gamma waves we were talking about earlier.
So whether we're, like, meditating on a mountaintop or shredding a guitar solo, our brains might be humming along on a similar frequency.
It's a fascinating possibility, right? And it means that this potential for experiencing oneness, it might be way more accessible than we think.
That makes sense. I mean, most of us have experienced flow states at some point, even if we didn't, like, have a name for it.
Exactly. Think about those times when you were so engrossed in something that you just like lost track of time, forgot about your worries, and you felt completely in the zone. Those are probably moments of flow.
So how do we create more of those moments? Like, what are the ingredients of a flow state?
Well, according to Csikszentmihalyi, one key ingredient is challenge. The activity needs to be engaging enough to like totally capture your attention, but not so overwhelming that you feel, anxious or frustrated.
So it's about finding that sweet spot, right?
Mm.
Where our skills are matched to the demands of the task. Too easy and we get bored.
Yeah.
Difficult and we just give up. But when we hit that balance, boom, flow state.
And potentially a glimpse of that oneness experience. Remember, when you're totally absorbed in something, that inner chatter, that constant sense of me versus the world, it tends to fade away.
Which brings us right back to the idea that maybe quieting that inner voice
Right.
is, like, crucial for experiencing oneness.
It's definitely part of the puzzle. And it makes me think about another fascinating finding from Altered Traits. This one's about yogis generating compassion. They found that when these yogis focused on cultivating compassion, their brains showed increased connectivity to the body, particularly the heart.
So compassion literally brings the heart into the picture.
Exactly. And remember how we were just talking about a quieter PCC, maybe leading to a less distinct sense of self? Well, this research suggests that when these yogis cultivate compassion, their brains actually become more in tune with those physical sensations associated with the heart. It's like they're embodying that feeling of interconnectedness.
This is all starting to make so much sense. So if meditation quiets that inner chatter and compassion brings the heart into the equation, could this be how we move beyond a purely mental experience of oneness to something we actually feel in our bodies?
It's a really insightful connection, and it points to something really important. Oneness isn't just an individual experience. It's also about our relationships with others and the world around us.
Right. Think about those, like, incredible moments of shared flow when musicians are jamming together totally in sync, or athletes are moving as one on a playing field. Could those be examples of, like, tapping into a deeper level of oneness, a collective experience that transcends individual boundaries?
Absolutely. And it gets us thinking about whether oneness is something we can actively cultivate in our lives, not just by quieting our minds, but by engaging with the world in a way that, fosters connection, compassion.
This is all incredibly inspiring. But before we get, like, too carried away, I do have a question about the potential downsides of this whole oneness thing. Can, like, too much focus on oneness become problematic?
That's a great question and an important one to address. You're right, like anything else, an extreme focus on oneness could have its downsides. Altered Traits actually touches on this when discussing the addictive potential of those flow states we were just talking about.
So it's like anything else. Too much of a good thing can backfire.
Exactly. We might become so attached to that feeling of oneness, of effortless concentration, that we start neglecting other important aspects of our lives, our
Yeah.
responsibilities, our relationships even.
So balance is key. We need to find a way to integrate these experiences of oneness into our life without letting them become a way to, like, check out of reality.
Precisely. And that's where mindfulness comes in. The embodied mind emphasizes that true mindfulness isn't just about cultivating a sense of oneness, it's also about developing a clear awareness of our thoughts, our feelings, our motivations, even the uncomfortable ones.
So we can enjoy those moments of connection, those feelings of oneness, but we don't, like, cling to them or use them as a way to avoid dealing with the challenges of everyday life.
Exactly. And I think it's also important to be aware of the potential for spiritual bypassing, which is when people use spiritual ideas or practices, like this pursuit of oneness, to avoid dealing with difficult emotions or unresolved traumas.
All right, so we need to be honest with ourselves about why we're drawn to this idea of oneness in the first place. Are we truly seeking a deeper understanding of ourselves and the world, or are we using it as a way to, like, escape from something uncomfortable?
Excellent point. And that honesty requires a willingness to confront those parts of ourselves that we might not like, those shadow sides that we might prefer to keep hidden.
Sounds like true oneness isn't just about connecting with the light, but also about acknowledging the darkness within ourselves and the world around us.
Beautifully put. And that willingness to embrace the full spectrum of human experience with all its messiness and complexity, that's essential for any, authentic exploration of oneness.
Okay, my mind is officially blown. We've covered so much ground in this deep dive. Maybe it's time for a quick recap just to help us, like, digest all these incredible insights.
A great idea. So far, we've explored this fascinating paradox of how we can experience a sense of oneness when, neurologically speaking, ourselves are actually fragmented. We dove into the world of meditation research and discovered evidence that altered brain states, like those involving a quieter PCC and heightened gamma wave activity, might be correlated with that, subjective experience of oneness.
And we talked about how compassion might literally bring the heart into the picture, allowing us to embody that feeling of interconnectedness with others.
We also ventured into the world of the embodied mind, which challenged our traditional notions of self and introduced us to the concept of enactivism, highlighting the interconnectedness of mind, body, and environment.
And we connected these profound insights to flow states, exploring the possibility that oneness might be accessible through, everyday activities that bring joy, challenge, and a sense of absorption in the moment.
And importantly, we explored the potential downsides of pursuing oneness, emphasizing the need for balance, mindfulness, and a willingness to engage with the full spectrum of human experience.
So much good stuff. But there's still more to uncover.
Right, absolutely. There are always more layers to peel back, more connections to make, more questions to explore.
Well, I'm definitely ready for more. But for now, I think we should give you some time to process all this, like mind-bending information. Welcome back. So I hope you've had some time to kind of process all those fascinating insights we've uncovered so far about, oneness. Now, I'm thinking maybe we can shift gears a little. See if we can distill all this knowledge into something, like, practical, something you can actually apply to your own life.
Yeah, that's a great goal. I mean, what's the point of all this exploration if we can't, find a way to actually integrate it into our, everyday experiences?
Exactly. So after diving deep into, altered traits and the embodied mind, what's the, like, biggest takeaway for you? What's that one aha moment you're walking away with?
For me, it's this realization that this feeling of oneness, it's not some mystical state reserved for monks or, spiritual masters. It's something that's potentially accessible to all of us. It might be experienced through dedicated practices like meditation, sure, or through those everyday moments of flow, when we're completely absorbed in an activity we love.
I love that. So it's not about becoming someone else entirely, but about, like, recognizing and cultivating those moments of connection that are already present in our lives.
Precisely. And it's about understanding that those moments that aren't just, fleeting experiences. They can actually teach us something really profound about the nature of reality and, our place in it.
It's like we're starting to see the world through this, like, new lens, one that emphasizes interconnectedness rather than, separation. But I got to admit, I'm still wrestling with this idea of a fragmented self. How can we feel so connected, so whole, if our brains are actually made up of all these different parts working? like independently?
That's a great question. And it's one that the embodied mind, really grapples with. Remember that idea of inactivism we discussed earlier? It suggests that our experience of self isn't like fixed or static, but rather something that's constantly being shaped by our interactions with the world. So maybe that feeling of oneness isn't about finding a like singular unified self, but about recognizing the fluid and interconnected nature of our being.
So instead of thinking of ourselves as these like separate independent entities, we can start to see ourselves as part of a larger web of relationships and interactions.
Exactly. And that shift in perspective, that can have a really profound impact on, how we live our lives. It can make
Mhm.
us more compassionate, more understanding, and more connected to the world around us.
Makes you wonder, if we could all cultivate this sense of oneness, even just a little bit more, what kind of like positive ripple effects that could have on society as a whole.
Yeah.
Imagine a world where people were more focused on collaboration and understanding rather than like competition and division.
It's a beautiful vision. And it's not as far-fetched as it might seem. Altered Traits actually highlights research showing that even brief practices like loving kindness meditation can increase feelings of empathy and, pro-social behavior.
So even small shifts in our like individual awareness can have a measurable impact on the world around us.
Absolutely. And that's, incredibly empowering. It means that each of us has the potential to contribute to a more connected and a more compassionate world simply by cultivating those qualities within ourselves.
So maybe the key to unlocking a greater sense of oneness and all the, benefits that come with it isn't about becoming someone else entirely, but about tapping into that, like potential for connection that already exists within each of us.
Beautifully put. And remember, embracing oneness, it's not about denying our individuality or pretending that everything is, always perfect. It's about holding that tension between the unity and the fragmentation, the light and the shadow, recognizing that both are essential parts of the human experience.
Right. It's about embracing the, fullness of life with all its messiness and beauty
Yeah.
and finding a sense of peace and connection within that like dynamic flow.
Exactly. And I think that leads us to a final, provocative thought for our listeners to ponder. If oneness isn't about finding a like solid, unchanging self, then what does it point to? Is it simply a fleeting experience, a momentary glimpse of something beyond, our ordinary perception? Or is it a deeper reality that we can learn to tap into more fully?
That's a wonderful question to leave our listeners with.
Yeah.
Something I'll certainly be reflecting on as I continue my own, exploration of oneness. And I encourage all of you listening to do the same. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep those brains buzzing.
Indeed. The mystery of oneness awaits.
Thanks for joining us on this incredible journey. Until next time, happy exploring.